7 years. That's how long Cleo shared a bed with the most terrifying creature in Europe, yet he never laid a single finger on her. She thought Benedict Schuyler despised her. She was wrong. Because tonight, the Vampire King is on his knees, begging for a single taste. The world knew Benedict Schuyler as an elusive British billionaire, a man who possessed sprawling estates across the Scottish Highlands and a monopoly on European logistics. But the shadow world, the hidden society of the nocturnal elite, knew him as the sovereign of the Northern Covens. He was a vampire of ancient, terrifying power, and Cleo Penelope Hastings was his wife. Their marriage was not born of love. It was a transaction forged in blood and ink. 7 years ago, her father, Richard Hastings, bankrupted their family's centuries-old estate. Worse, he embezzled from the Schuyler Syndicate. The penalty for stealing from vampires was a slow, agonizing death. To spare his life, a treaty was struck. The Hastings bloodline, though financially ruined, was an aristocratic human lineage of impeccable purity. At 18 years old, she was packed into a black town car in the dead of night and driven to Schuyler Manor, traded like currency to settle a debt. She had been prepared for a monster. She had braced herself for pain, for dominance, to be used as a personal blood bag by a creature of the night. But the reality of her marriage proved to be a far crueler psychological torture. Benedict Schuyler never touched her. For 2,555 nights they shared the same cavernous, silk-sheeted bed in his master suite. He was breathtakingly beautiful, possessing the sharp, aristocratic features of a fallen angel with piercing silver-grey eyes and dark hair. Yet he treated her as if she were made of toxic glass. When he slipped into bed hours after midnight, his skin was as cold as marble, and he would lay rigidly on the absolute edge of the mattress. If she accidentally rolled over in her sleep and a single inch of her skin brushed against his, he would flinch, rise immediately, and spend the rest of the night locked in his study. At first she felt relief, but as the years bled into one another, that relief curdled into a deep, humiliating agony. She was his wife in name only. She attended the lavish midnight galas on his arm, smiling for the cameras and the prying eyes of the vampire court. She wore the blindingly expensive Schuyler diamonds around her neck, but behind the closed mahogany doors of their estate, she was a ghost. She watched how the other vampires looked at her. Vivienne Carmichael, Benedict's ruthless second-in-command, made sure she knew exactly what her untouchable status meant. "You're a rotting asset, Cleo," Vivienne sneered one evening in the manor's library, swirling a glass of thick, crimson wine. 7 years, and he hasn't taken a single drop of your blood. He hasn't claimed you. A human consort who remains unmarked is a human consort who is unwanted. Everyone in the syndicate is laughing. We are simply waiting for the day he grows bored and tosses you into the freezing lock. Her words planted a seed of dark insecurity that rooted deep in Cleo's chest. Did he find her repulsive? Was her blood somehow tainted? She spent hours staring into her vanity mirror, pulling at her skin, analyzing every flaw, wondering why the man she was legally bound to looked at her with such tightly coiled restraint, or was it disgust? The breaking point of her sanity occurred just 3 weeks before her 25th birthday. She was in the estate's glass greenhouse, pruning a bush of rare black roses that Benedict had imported from Turkey. The thorns were vicious, and her hand slipped. A sharp barb sliced deep into the pad of her index finger. She gasped, plopping the shears. Bright crimson blood welled to the surface, dripping softly onto the marble floor. Suddenly, the temperature in the greenhouse plummeted. She turned to see Benedict standing in the archway. He had just returned from a syndicate meeting in Paris, still wearing his bespoke charcoal suit. But he wasn't looking at her face. His silver eyes were locked onto the drop of blood on her finger. The transformation was terrifying. The whites of his eyes flooded pitch black. The veins under his pale skin darkened, webbing across his cheekbones, and his jaw subtly unhinged as his fangs descended. He took a predatory step toward her, a low, guttural growl vibrating from his chest. It was a sound that made every human survival instinct inside her scream. "Benedict," she whispered, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest. "I cut myself. It's okay." He took another step, closing the distance between them in a blur of supernatural speed. He was suddenly towering over her, chest heaving. She could smell the cold ozone and expensive cologne clinging to him. For a split second she thought he was finally going to take her, that the 7-year drought was over. She tilted her neck, submitting, a strange mix of terror and desperate longing washing over her. Instead, Benedict squeezed his eyes shut, his fists clenched so hard at his sides that she heard the bones in his knuckles crack. "Get out," he snarled, his voice a harsh, jagged rasp that sounded nothing like her composed husband. "Benedict, please." "I said get out, Cleo," he roared, slamming his fist into the reinforced glass wall of the greenhouse, shattering the pane into a million glittering pieces. "Leave my sight before I do something we will both regret." Tears stung her eyes. The humiliation was absolute. She ran from the greenhouse, leaving him standing amidst the shattered glass, completely convinced that her husband was violently repulsed by her very existence. She didn't know then that his reaction wasn't disgust. It was the agonizing, barely leashed restraint of a starving man fighting his own demons to keep her alive. The night of her 25th birthday arrived, marked by the most extravagant gala the shadow world had seen in a decade. It was hosted at the Skylar Tower, a towering spike of black glass in the heart of London. To the human world it was an exclusive charity ball. To the vampires it was a high-stakes political summit to renew territorial boundaries. For her it was a deadline. In vampire lore, 25 was the age of maturation for a human consort. If an aristocratic bloodline remained unclaimed by this age, the marriage treaty could be legally dissolved, and the human could be discarded or claimed by another. She stood in front of the mirror in the penthouse dressing room. She was wearing a blood-red silk gown that clung to every curve, plunging daringly low in the back. Her dark hair was swept up, exposing the long, pale column of her neck. She wore no jewelry, deliberately leaving the space where a vampire's mark should be completely bare. It was an act of defiance, a silent challenge to the husband who refused to look at her. When she descended the grand staircase into the ballroom, conversations halted. Hundreds of immortal eyes turned toward her, their gazes hungry, calculating and mocking. She found Benedict standing near the grand piano, speaking with a Russian coven leader. He looked devastatingly handsome in a black tuxedo. When his eyes met hers, a muscle feathered in his jaw and his gaze darkened, sweeping over her exposed skin. But, as always, he looked away first. He offered her no smile, no hand to guide her down the stairs. She swallowed the lump in her throat and stepped into the viper's nest alone. The night was a blur of forced smiles and dodging predatory advances from foreign vampires who knew her husband had not claimed her. As the hours ticked closer to midnight, she found herself cornered on the outdoor terrace, overlooking the glittering skyline of London. "You look like a lamb waiting for the slaughter, Cleo." She turned to see Dominic Schuyler stepping out of the shadows. Dominic was Benedict's younger, estranged brother. Where Benedict was cold and restrained, Dominic was wildly chaotic, his eyes a mocking, icy blue. He had been exiled from the London court years ago, but the summit had granted him temporary amnesty. "Leave me alone, Dominic," she said, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill wind. He didn't listen. He moved closer, trapping her against the glass balustrade. "You really don't know, do you?" he murmured, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You think he doesn't want you. I see the way you look at him, Cleo, like a desperate puppy begging for a scrap of affection. My marriage is none of your business." "But it is," Dominic whispered, leaning in so close she could feel the cold radiating from him. "Because of midnight, you turn 25. The treaty expires. He hasn't claimed you, Cleo, because he's waiting for the legal loophole to throw you out. He despises your father, and he looks at you and only sees the man who stole from us. Her heart hammered against her ribs. You're lying. Am I? Dominic reached out, trailing a freezing finger down the side of her neck. She shuddered, trying to pull away, but his grip on the stone railing trapped her. You are an unblemished Hastings. Your blood is a delicacy. When Benedict dissolves the bond at midnight, you will be fair game. And I think I will claim you for myself just to spite him. Before she could scream, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the terrace. The ambient noise of the London traffic seemed to vanish. Remove your hand from my wife, Dominic. The voice was terrifyingly calm, but it vibrated with a lethal frequency. Benedict stood in the terrace doorway. He had abandoned his tuxedo jacket. His tie was loosened, and his eyes were no longer silver. They were the abyssal, terrifying black of a fully realized predator. Dominic smirked, dropping his hand from her neck. Just keeping her entertained, brother. Though I suppose she'll be my problem in about 20 minutes anyway. In a fraction of a second, Benedict crossed the terrace. There was a sickening crack as he drove his fist into Dominic's throat, lifting his brother entirely off the ground by his neck and slamming him over the edge of the glass balustrade. Dominic dangled hundreds of feet above the London streets, his eyes wide with sudden panic. If you ever breathe in her direction again, Benedict hissed, his fangs fully bared, I will rip your head from your shoulders and mail it to your exile in pieces. Do you understand me? He didn't wait for an answer. Benedict tossed Dominic back onto the terrace floor like a rag doll, then turned to Cleo. His chest was heaving, his control utterly shattered. He grabbed her wrist, his grip bruising, burning like dry ice, and dragged her off the terrace, ignoring the gasps of the aristocrats as they marched through the ballroom and directly into the private elevators. The ride up to the penthouse was suffocating. She was shaking, tears spilling over her cheeks. Dominic's words echoed in her mind. He's waiting for the legal loophole to throw you out. The elevator doors opened, and he pulled her down the hallway, shoving her into his private chambers. He locked the heavy oak doors behind them with a definitive click. So this is it, she sobbed, the 7 years of rejection finally boiling over into pure rage. Midnight is here. Are you finally going to kill me, Benedict? Or are you just going to throw me out onto the street like your brother said? Tell me. Benedict stood by the locked door, his hands trembling violently. He looked like a man being burned alive from the inside out. He dropped to his knees. The sovereign of the Northern Covens, the most feared creature in the shadow world, collapsed onto the floor at her feet. Cleo, he choked out, his voice a raw, shattered plea. Please. She froze. Please what? He looked up at her, his terrifying black eyes swimming with unshed tears. Please, let me claim you. Let me taste you. I have starved for 7 years, Cleo. If I don't take your blood right now, I'm going to lose my mind. She stared down at the man who commanded armies of immortals, the ruthless billionaire who could collapse the European economy with a single phone call. Benedict Schuyler was kneeling on the Persian rug of their penthouse, his tailored shirt rumpled, his breathing ragged. The sheer vulnerability in his terrifying pitch-black eyes shattered every assumption she had built over the last 7 years. Starved, she whispered, her voice trembling as she took a tentative step backward. What are you talking about? You have access to the finest blood banks in the world. You're the sovereign. Ordinary blood is ash in my mouth, Benedict rasped, his hands gripping the edges of his own slacks as if fighting the urge to reach out and grab her ankles. The month I signed that marriage treaty, the moment our souls were bound by syndicate law, my biology locked onto yours. A sovereign mates for life, Cleo. Once the vow is sealed, we can only draw true sustenance from our spouse. For 7 years I have lived on the absolute bare minimum of synthesized plasma just to keep my heart beating. It tastes like dust, it provides no string. Her mind reeled, trying to process the magnitude of his confession. If that's true, why didn't you just bite me? Why treat me like a disease? You made me feel completely worthless, Benedict. I thought you hated me. Benedict squeezed his eyes shut, a sound of profound agony tearing from his throat. When he opened them again, the blackness was receding, replaced by the piercing silver she knew so well, though they were bright with unshed moisture. Because if I had tasted a single drop of your blood before your 25th birthday, it would have killed us both in the most agonizing way imaginable, he said, his voice dropping to a heavy, devastated whisper. He slowly rose to his feet, keeping a careful distance between them. He walked over to a heavy oak desk, pouring a glass of amber scotch with hands that visibly shook. Your father, Richard, didn't just embezzle a few million from my logistics firms, Benedict explained, tossing the liquor back in one swallow. He stumbled upon a shadow ledger during a corporate merger with the Astor Estates. He discovered the truths about the Hastings bloodline. You are not just human aristocrats, Pleo. Your family carries an incredibly rare genetic anomaly that the ancients called the Siren's Veil. Your blood is practically narcotic to my kind. It grants unimaginable power. She touched her own neck, suddenly feeling intensely exposed. Then why? Because the Siren's Veil is highly volatile, Benedict interrupted, his gaze locking onto hers with fierce intensity. During a human's maturation process before the exact moment of their 25th birthday, the blood is violently unstable. If a vampire consumes it, it acts as an absolute neurotoxin. The Rothschild syndicate lost 3 of their elders to a siren bloodline in the 1800s because they were too impatient to wait for the girl to mature. It drove them rabid, and they drained her dry before their own organs liquefied. It might. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. She fell back against the heavy velvet arm of the chair, the puzzle pieces violently snapping into place. Your father, Benedict continued, his voice hardening with disgust, found out what you were. He knew foreign syndicates would pay billions to own a siren. He was secretly negotiating to sell you to a brutal subterranean coven in Romania. I intercepted the communication. You used the embezzlement as an excuse, she realized, the horror dawning on her. The debt wasn't real. It was the only way to legally extract you from his custody without starting a global vampire war, Benedict said, stepping closer, though he still kept a torturous 3 feet of distance between them. I claimed you as a debt payment. I brought you to my estate to protect you, but the cost was binding myself to you. He reached out, his long, cold fingers hovering just an inch from her cheek, desperately wanting to touch her skin, but refusing to close the gap. The restraint vibrating through his body was a physical force in the room. Do you have any idea what these 7 years have been like for me, Cleo? He whispered, his voice cracking, to sleep next to you every night, to hear the erratic flutter of your pulse against the silk pillows, to smell the sweet, intoxicating scent of your blood radiating from your veins, knowing that a single taste would bring me paradise, only to immediately end your life and mine? I had to treat you like glass. I had to build a wall of ice around my own heart, because if I let myself show you even an ounce of the desperate, all-consuming love I have for you, my control would have snapped. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. The coldness, the flinching, the separate lives. It wasn't revulsion. It was the absolute, agonizing sacrifice of a starving predator protecting its prey from its own monstrous nature. When you cut your finger in the greenhouse, she sobbed, remembering the pure terror in his eyes. The scent of your raw blood hitting the air nearly broke my mind, Benedict confessed, dropping his hand. I had to leave the estate for 3 days just to cage the beast inside me. And tonight when Dominic touched you, when he threatened to take what is mine, Benedict looked toward the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room. The polished brass pendulum swung back and forth, eating away the final seconds of her 24th year. Tick, tick, tick. 10 seconds, Benedict whispered, his silver eyes completely overtaken by the abyssal black once more. The veins beneath his skin darkened, his fangs sliding down in a lethal, breathtaking display of predatory hunger. 10 seconds, Cleo, and the poison leaves your veins. 10 seconds and you become my queen. Oh, don't. The first chime of midnight echoed through the penthouse. It felt like a physical shockwave. She didn't wait for him to ask again. She closed the distance between them, grabbing the lapels of his ruined shirt and tilted her head back, baring the long, pale expanse of her neck to him. "Claim me," she breathed. Benedict let out a sound that was half sob, half raw. His arms banded around her waist, lifting her flush against his hard, marble-cold chest. One of his hands buried itself in her pinned-up hair, tearing the diamond clips away so her dark curls fell in a cascade around their shoulders. Dong! The second chime rang out as his mouth descended on her neck. He didn't bite immediately. He dragged his tongue over her leaping pulse point, inhaling the scent of her skin like a man who had just breached the surface of the ocean after drowning for a decade. The sheer reverence in his touch made her knees buckle, but he held her firm. "Dong, mine," he growled against her skin, and then his fangs pierced her flesh. She gasped, her back arching against his arm. She had expected pain, but instead a rush of euphoric liquid heat exploded from the puncture wounds, flooding her veins. It was the venom, the mystical binding agent of the sovereign. Her vision flashed with brilliant colors. She could suddenly feel him. She felt the hollow, agonizing cavern of his starvation, the crushing weight of his loneliness, and the fierce, protective love he harbored for her. As her blood hit his tongue, a violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. He drank deeply, groaning as the siren's veil, now fully matured and safe, ignited his dormant strength. The air in the penthouse began to crackle with static electricity. The glass windows overlooking the London skyline rattled in their frames. The power of a fully fed, fully bonded sovereign was radiating from him in terrifying, invisible waves. He pulled back slowly, licking a stray drop of crimson from his bottom lip. The wounds on her neck had already closed, sealed by his venom, leaving 2 perfect, silver crescent moon scars. "The mark of the king. Cleo," he whispered, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, beautiful light. "My soul. My queen." Before she could answer, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse were blown completely off their hinges, splintering into heavy shards of wood that rained down on the carpet. Benedict instantly shoved her behind him, shielding her with his body. Standing in the ruined doorway was Vivian Carmichael, flanked by a dozen heavily armed rogue vampires. She held a custom-machined tactical rifle loaded with ultraviolet phosphorus rounds, weapons designed specifically to execute high-ranking immortals. "Well, well," Vivian sneered, stepping over the wreckage. "So the coward finally found his fangs. It's too late, Benedict. The Syndicate watched you humiliate yourself over a human for 7 years. You are starved. You are weak. Dominic's little stunt on the terrace was just a distraction to get you away from your guards. The Northern Covens belong to me now." She raised the rifle, aiming it directly at Benedict's chest. "Kill them both. Be quick about it." But Vivienne had made a fatal miscalculation. She had assumed Benedict was still the starving, restrained ghost he had been for 7 years. She didn't realize what coursed through his veins now. Benedict didn't even flinch. He let out a low, terrifying laugh that vibrated with a sonic resonance, shattering the remaining crystal decanters on his desk. "You always were an impatient creature, Vivian," Benedict said softly. He didn't run. He simply raised a single hand. The air pressure in the room dropped so fast her ears popped. The static electricity they had generated during the bonding suddenly weaponized. Invisible telekinetic force, the legendary long-lost magic of a true sovereign fueled by siren blood, exploded outward. The dozen rogue vampires were thrown backward simultaneously, pinned violently against the stone walls of the hallway with such force that she heard their bones shatter. Vivienne gasped, dropping her rifle as an invisible hand wrapped around her throat, lifting her 3 feet into the air. Benedict stepped forward, his eyes glowing like dying stars. "You have trespassed in my home. You have threatened my queen. Your execution will be broadcast to every syndicate from London to Moscow as a reminder." He closed his fist. Vivienne's body turned instantly to grey ash, crumbling to the floor in a fine dust before she could even scream. The remaining rogues, pinned to the walls, began to beg for mercy. Benedict ignored them, turning back to her. The terrifying aura of violence instantly melted away as he looked at her face. He gently reached out, tracing the silver crescent scars on her neck with a reverent thumb. "We have a mess to clean up," he murmured, his voice soft, meant only for her, "and a court to rule." "Let them wait," she said, pulling him down by the lapels of his ruined shirt, pressing her lips to his cold, perfect mouth. The 7 years of winter were finally over. The king had his queen, and the shadow world would never be the same again. Do you love thrilling, dramatic stories filled with dark romance, supernatural twists, and shocking betrayals? If Cleo and Benedict's intense journey kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow dark romance lovers, and hit subscribe so you never miss another heart-pounding tale. Which character was your favorite? Let us know below.